Whatever you want.
Well, it's comical.
Yeah.
I don't like to give a lot of talks. I am definitely a writer, but for this topic is very, very close to my heart for reasons that I am going to speak with you about. And so when Meta was doing these, mentioned to me she was doing this series, I had just come back from the Philippines, and I said I really wanted to be part of this. So thank you so much, Meta, and thank you to the friends who have come out today. I'm not an academic, and I think most of the people who spoke here have been academics. So I'm going to do what I do best, which is I'm going to begin by telling you some stories, because I think that's my gift as a journalist, is to go out and tell the stories that are really impacted by the research that goes on these issues. The global migration of women for work, particularly caregiving, is no different than the trafficking and the horror that you hear of those trafficked for sex. You just don't hear their stories so much because we don't think their suffering is as great. And anyway, so let me begin by not talking to you about the big globalization and how this all came about, by telling you first a little bit about me and how I got onto all of this. Right from the beginning when I became a writer, I was always drawn to human rights, child and women's issues. At the time, I had no idea why. I now know, and I will tell you later on. And I was really fortunate that I had the opportunity in Miami for the Miami Herald, and when I entered at the New York Times to do those stories. And so when I came back to Canada and was working at Maclean's, a series of unfortunate events led me very quickly in my career into trafficking. And that was the spring of 2001. I had just become married. The magazine went through a round of layoffs, including all of their senior investigative reporters. And at the same time, I'd only been there about a year. I had this one little organization in Toronto called Streetlight Support Services that kept sending me press releases saying, please come and see our program. And so the unfortunate events was we had no staff, very competent people were let go, and they had no content for the magazine. So I'm telling you a little bit about the workings behind the scenes. So I was basically told, go out there, do any story that you want. And so I ended up at Streetlight Support Services, which is a diversion program for street prostitutes, which I believe has been canceled just recently. And sat in these round tables and listened to the women's story. Almost all of them were low-income Aboriginal Canadians, a few Anglo-Saxon Canadians. But there was one woman in the corner who barely spoke a word. She had to be in the program else she faced some form of jail sentence or a big fine. And she was Chinese. And she didn't speak any other language, and she would be picked up at the end of the day in a limousine. Different men would pick her up every day, and I became really curious. And at this point, no one was really hearing anything about the trafficking of women as prostitutes from other countries coming into Canada. Victor Malarick at CTV and I were probably doing these stories more or less at the same time. So I began to get close to this Chinese woman, and that is what I did the two-page story on Streetlight. But that was my real entry into trafficking issues. This was a Chinese woman that ended up coming here legally through a work permit to work in the strip clubs. I don't need to tell you that story. I think that's, that program has been changed and amended because of so much press. But it led me into the trafficking issue in Canada, both as a destination point and as a transit point for women being trafficked from here to the United States. Primarily my first entry into this was as prostitutes. I spent, just to lighten up a bit, I spent that summer, because there's my personal life sidetracks along with my professional life with this story. I was visiting the strip clubs and massage parlors, very pregnant with my first daughter, I shouldn't say very, you couldn't see that much. And a 355-pound former Mr. Bear Toronto, heavily tattooed, who was sort of my bodyguard. But he was also sort of gave me, at one point, his wife or girlfriend said to me that there was nothing they could do to make me look like I would fit into a massage parlor other than bring him. So I spent my summer doing that. And that fall, I met with a lot of the academics and the frontline workers and the grassroots groups. And so I'm growing. And in at that point, too, I should say that Status of Women Canada and the Canadian government had done a series of studies and had done a big report of trafficking of women in Canada. And another sideline to this was the mail order brides, both from Russia, but primarily from the Philippines. So by the time I was 7 months pregnant, I'm sitting in a coffee shop right in front of Cecilia Diason, who founded the BC Philippine Women's Center. And we're talking about mail order brides. And Cecilia, who became a lifelong friend, and who's actually in Toronto and speaking at York on this very subject tonight, turned to me at one point after we talked about mail order brides. We talked to the study, and she said, "Susan, who's going to care for that child in your stomach when you go back to work?" And I hadn't thought about it. I didn't know. And so Cecilia and her colleague Joy began to tell me about trafficking of nannies. And at that point, I didn't think anything of it. I was going on maternity leave. I didn't think that caregiving was a big issue at this point. I was a first-time mom. The trafficking issue to me was what I would have considered what I opened up with blatant exploitation, sexual abuse and whatnot. I didn't see the trafficking angle quite yet. So I go on my maternity leave with my first daughter, Lauren, and I spent not quite a year going to the parks. I'm not in the strip clubs anymore. I'm in the parks. And everyone there is a Filipino nanny. And I began to hear their stories. And then I'm not going for coffee with my colleagues talking about the strip clubs or, I'm going for coffee with other moms. And I'm hearing about how horrible their nannies are. So I'm introduced to this completely new and interesting world of Toronto, where you have, now I think the Filipino community in this city is the third largest immigrant population, largely due to the live-in caregiver program, which I'm going to explain a little bit about. And then I had the mummies, and the Filipino nannies are telling me their stories of separation from their families. They're telling me the long routes that they've come here through Hong Kong, through Israel. They're telling me about the abuse. They're telling me about the 7 days a week of no pay, very little pay, working overtime. You know this story. I'm not going to go over this part of the story. You know this. It just, in this society, there is an underground where these women are, forced to work very long hours, no overtime pay. Their children in particular, some of them, are allowed to say whatever they want to these nannies, and the nannies will get in trouble if the parents come back and they hear that. And then I'm hearing from the parents, well, in between raising my 3 children, she didn't have time to polish my silverware. And I'm not joking here. And hearing who I thought were my friends and quite liberated women saying, well, it's my Filipino, in Muskoka, it's my Filipino nanny's day off. She's just here. She's in the live-in caregiver program. She wants to go to the city. We're just going to go leave her at the bus stop at Gordon Bay Marina. I don't know if any of you know Muskoka, but I cannot imagine someone just coming to this country and being put on the side of the road and said, you flag the bus down like this. And then you have only 24 hours to get to Toronto and come back. So when I go back to work, even before I went back to work, I'm picking up the phone and I'm calling Cecilia and I'm saying, okay, let's start doing the nanny story. And that was back in, I think, 2003, 2004. I'm just going to read from my notes because I think this part you really need to know if you don't know already. And that's a little bit of history. Over the past century, Canada has had a long history of importing women to work as nannies. It began with Scottish, Irish, British nannies. Very easily they integrated into our society, often probably some in the room, their grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and whatnot. When this pool of women began to dry up for a number of reasons, they got married or they didn't want to be nannies anymore, Canada as a whole began to turn its gaze to women of color, particularly at one point women from the West Indies and Jamaica, and developed elaborate immigration programs to allow these women to come to this country. Certainly in my research in doing this, when I say we, Canada began to look elsewhere for nannies, the rights that we gave the women became less and less and less as we went to women of color. And one of the stipulations, right from certainly the last 40, 50 years, is that when the women come, they cannot bring their children. And many, particularly from Jamaica, ended up lying, saying they had no children, they left their kids back home. I'm very good friends with Rachel Manley, whose ancestors were the Manleys of Jamaica, and she says the export of women from Jamaica is one of the really big social issues that they're seeing in that country today. She called those children that were left behind by their Jamaican nannies feral kids. Really the only relationship they had with their mothers were barrels that the kids would get full of presents, toys, Toblerone bars, pretty dresses, that sort of thing. The current program that we have is called the Living Caregiver Program, and it's had little modifications since 1991. But and basically what this program is they've all evolved, is it's seen that Canada has a labor shortage in women who want to, or people who want to do caregiving. So families or institutions can go and hire a woman from abroad to be that caregiver. But unlike a wealthy immigrant or an immigrant who comes here to work, has education status, women that are coming in under the Living Caregiver Program are not given language status. They have to work 2 years out of 3 living in their employer's home. One of the things that Canada does offer that makes us appear the plum destination is that we do allow the women, and I say women, there are some men that apply for this, citizens begin to apply for the permanent residency at the end of that 2 years. But there are so many labor and human rights violations just within that concept of bringing women here. They have to live in their employers' homes. I've interviewed the women, and not a single one walks away and says, it's been amazing. It's terrible. As I wrote in the very first story that I ended up writing on this, looked at the abuse, the labor abuse and human rights abuse in the Living Caregiver Program, and it was in the Walrus. And as I quoted someone in that, during a period when individual rights were enshrined in law and women fighting free from the kitchen and the nursery entered the workforce in numbers almost equaling their male counterparts, many of the nannies were suffering physical and mental abuse at the hands of the very people they had liberated from the routine drudgery of family life. Christina, who was the lead in my story on nanny abuse, ended up, a Filipino woman, ended up in Vancouver, was given a home in the basement, in the furnace room. She had to care for 7 kids. She was paid $200 a week and was managed. That story ended up being taken and made into a documentary film, shot in Saywell, and it continues to be aired on Global, and it follows me following the abuse of living caregiver programs. The export of Filipino women in particular countries to richer nations began in the 1970s. As Manila, or the Philippines, looked for ways to reduce unemployment and to diversify their economy beyond their farming, agriculture. It's a very rich natural resources. The country was facing a lot of civil unrest, and President Ferdinand Marcos came up with this idea that we'll export the unrest and began to send men abroad, particularly to the Middle East, to work in construction. It was a strategy that built and built and built, and is still today. 3,000 Filipino women alone leave the Philippines every day to work abroad. Over the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, when more and more Western women entered the workforce, and families became broken, not in the sense of divorce, I'm talking in the sense of grandparents weren't in the same cities, weren't raising the children. There was a gap, and the Philippines, whether consciously or unconsciously, I'm sure it's conscious, realized this gap and began to really encourage the export of Filipino women. Today, in the Live-In Caregiver Program, 95% of the women coming to the country are from the Philippines. As Gloria Arroyo once said when she was president of the Philippines, the Filipina, which is slang, considered slang in the Middle East for slave. I can't speak any louder. I'm sorry, I don't have a loud voice. Do you want to sit here? Okay. She called the Filipino woman her nation's hero. Today, females are the principal export, and in 1998, Filipinos working abroad sent home almost $8 billion to the Philippines in what they call remittances. And while official statistics say that about 11 million Filipinos, men and women, work abroad, unofficially, some estimate it to be close to 25 million, and the population is only 80 million. So you're talking of the most exported people nation on the planet. Okay, and so while the Philippines economy improved with the inflow of foreign earnings, so it's been able to quell any unrest that it would have. Ottawa, in turn, could boast, this is from my Nannies story, in turn could boast that it had provided the baby boomers with a program to help them raise their families while allowing both spouses to work. Audrey Maclean, a law professor at the University of Toronto, said in that story, the Philippines has generated this new hero. The Filipino woman is seen as the migrant worker who is lifting their country out of poverty. In Canada, the Filipino woman is seen as the domestic worker who has come to the family's rescue. Canada simply doesn't have to address, really, we don't have to address a national daycare program. We don't have to pressure our businesses to put in place different daycare programs to really address some of the problems with working families because of the Filipino nanny. My understanding is that the Filipino community is now the third largest, not just in Toronto, but in all of Canada. And while certainly in the 1970s and early 80s, many Filipinos came to the country as skilled workers and worked as nurses, worked as teachers, worked as doctors. Most, by far, and I don't have the actual statistics, but certainly anecdotally, more than the majority of the people, the Filipinos in Canada, they can trace their immigration somehow to the Live-In Caregiver Program, either as the nannies themselves or when they bring their children here. And that's where I would like to go next, is the children of the nannies. Not long after I wrote the story on nanny abuse, which looked at the human rights violations, I met two individuals, both children of the nannies, Ian Milos and Roderick Carrion. And these were both very straight-A students back in the Philippines. Their mothers left them when they were very young. Ian was about 3. Roderick was a tiny bit older. But they had an idyllic life there. They lived with their grandmother. They lived in a rural area. They went to school. Ian harbored dreams of being a pilot. He had straight-A marks. Roderick was brilliant too. Their mothers ended up here, eventually after 10 years apart, where both the mothers went home once to visit their family, not because they didn't want to, A, because of salary, and B, while they can apply for permanent residency after 2 years, we know it takes far longer than that for them to even begin the application to bring their families here. So you're looking at years, if not sometimes more than a decade, before these families are reunited. So Ian, who doesn't know his mom now, he's not raised by her. He only knows her as the barrel kid who gets the presents sent home, including the photographs, is at a very vulnerable age, an early teenager, plucked from this home where he had dreams and family and community in the Philippines, and brought here. Same with Roderick. They don't speak the language, so they're a visible minority, but they also don't know their caregivers. They've now suffered twice abandonment. Early studies done on the Filipino communities today have shown, out of BC, have shown that Filipino children are faring the worst in terms of academic standing, dropout rates, teen pregnancy of any immigrant population in this country. This is the same argument that the Jamaican community used to argue too, saying, you know, part of this can be blamed on bringing our mothers here. These children don't know their mothers. They are suffering terribly. Ian and Roderick, who are now close with their mothers more as friendship, ended up dropping out of school themselves. Roderick became head of a very nasty gang before he became political and an activist in Montreal. Ian, I believe, is a student here, but for a while he did drugs. He was miserable, and you know, he didn't know his family. And these were both students that had really, really high hopes at one stage in their life. And this is where I become very personal, both as a mom and as a journalist with this topic. And that is, as Byron knows, and Meta knows, my mother left my family when I was 3. And I have no connection whatsoever. My grandmother raised me. So whether we want to say, you know, we can do all the studies in the world, and we can say, you know, it's okay for these families to be separated for 10 years. I mean, I've heard the argument from all the moms, but we're doing these women a favor. I can tell you, I have no bond with my mother. My mother to me is my grandmother and my stepmom, who were in my life since I was a child. So I know what these kids are experiencing. They're trying their best. And then the nannies, they're heartbroken. They moved here, they came here, believing they were giving their children a better life. And now their children don't know them, and they will never know them. So this issue became very personal for me, as you can see. Anyway, so I ended up writing a story and looking at the children of the caregivers. And I drew the parallels to the Jamaican and the West Indian community, some of the gang problems that we have here, and really pinpointing and turning a finger and looking at Canada's immigration program that brings the women here. About this time last year, I decided, okay, I've done all these series of stories, but I haven't done it from the point of view of the Philippines. So I applied for an Asia Pacific Fellowship to examine the phenomenon of the nannies' children back in the Philippines, primarily because I have been hearing that now the Philippine society is beginning to decay. The social fabric, the Catholic, very traditional family, was beginning to decay and erode because of the export of so many mothers. And I got the grant and planned to go to the Philippines. But over the year, became very, very busy with another number of book projects. And when I boarded the plane to Manila, I vowed up and down that this was the absolute last story I was doing on the Philippines. I said I will honor my commitments to the Asia Pacific Fellowship. I will write the story of the children left behind, but then I'm going to move on from this topic. Within 2 days of arriving, I am emailing Shelley Saywell, who did the film for Global, and I'm emailing my colleague Rob McCullough, who runs an investigative reporting for the BBC and CNN. And I told them both that our work has just begun. That all that we've done until now was just research. My first visits in Manila were to the slum areas. And most of the mothers here are not attempting to move abroad because they can't even afford to go to university. You have to go to university to even begin to be moving abroad. But what astonished me is that most of the women that I met in these slum areas, their mothers had moved abroad. So our happy Canadian society who likes to think, oh, we're doing these families a favor, very happy Filipino people were telling me beautiful stories of their lives until I said, well, what about your mother? Would break down in tears and then show me that they're worse off. They're not in their farming communities, their families. They're now living in the slums. And I asked them, I thought the main motivation of families to move abroad is to send money home so that you can go to college and university. And, it's just not enough. The children in the slums said, well, it didn't go far enough. Employers who deducted pay, mothers who ended up moving on and starting new families, that happened, but not that much. And other bills were paid, there just wasn't enough to lift families out of poverty. Another very disturbing fact is you're talking 5, 10, 15 years apart of husband and wives. Husbands have moved on too. So you've got abandoned children all over the Philippines. Husbands with new families. The slums, like the slums I visited in Cambodia and Kenya, were awful. I don't think I need to describe them. But what I found really different in the Philippines, not just in the slum areas, but all over, is that it is so blatantly out in the open. The glue sniffing, the shabu using. Women in the Philippines are now the #1 choice for sex traffickers. Sex trafficking warlords or middlemen openly walk the slum areas and recruit women right in front of their families. The government, no one cares. They're looking for young women with Western features, lots of money, right out in the open. The country is also the #1 choice of drug traffickers. And my very first stories as an investigative reporter were looking at the Colombian drug cartel and women being used as drug mules. Now the Filipino woman is the #1 choice. Much of the drug trafficking, certainly of cocaine now, some of it comes through West Africa. The West Africans are in the Philippines recruiting the women right out in the open. It's like, welcome to the Philippines for these people. 400 Filipino women right now are in Peruvian jails for cocaine-related crimes. Most of them are trafficking as mules. 3 women are on death row in China for heroin smuggling. I am sure none of them were users, but they were all lured by traffickers. On the way back to Manila, I am entranced by the billboards. Have any of you been to Manila? Okay, they have apartment-sized billboards of their super rich, because the Philippines is hugely poor, no middle class, and then very, very, very rich. And so you have Manny Pacquiao, the boxer, his wife, and apartment-style billboards advertising skin lightening, advertising everything from go to the shopping malls. Shopping malls are big there. All the money that's sent home to the Philippines, shopping malls. And Gloria Arroyo, of course, at the time that I was there, was about to be impeached for, anyways. Long story short is you've got a very two-tier country. Very small elite, very poor, nothing in between. The plan that Ferdinand Marcos set out to begin with has worked. Any dissent during martial law was killed. Any middle class that remains, any intelligentsia is gone. They're all abroad. Anyone educated moves elsewhere. Those that do remain and try to be activists are so poor they can't even pay bus money to get some of the women who are trying to mobilize in the slum areas to get down into the capital, to Manila, to protest. The country is also a military base for the U.S. I'm not sure if you knew that, but most of the troops from Iraq are heading back to the Philippines. And there's civil unrest in Mindanao involving Muslim populations there that want to separate. And foreign workers have a special line at the airport. There are ads all over, so you have very posh advertisements luring people to buy things with very beautiful young women who are the country's elite, next to move abroad, all out in the open, streets upon streets of this is how you get your money back home, this is how you train to be a nanny in a foreign country, that sort of thing. And the rich can more or less do whatever they want because there's no middle to really protest. The United Nations defines human trafficking as this is where that is now gonna, as most of you in the room are kind of like where I'm gonna go with this last part. The United Nations defines human trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purposes of exploitation. The United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific views the Asia-Pacific region as the most vulnerable region for trafficking because of its large population, growing urbanization, and poverty. Trafficking is a violation of human rights. Victims of trafficking suffer from physical and mental abuse and social stigmatization. They become isolated, losing ties with their former families. At the societal level, trafficking undermines developmental efforts and raises social and health costs. I went to the Philippines with the viewpoint that after all my years working on this issue, the Live-In Caregiver Program, that the Live-In Caregiver Program should be amended. That if foreign women's labor is so crucial to our economy, is so crucial to our families, that the women be given status upon arrival, they can live out in the community, and they can bring their families with them. I now don't hold that view. I now believe that the Live-In Caregiver Program should be abolished. I left the Philippines believing that we should scrap it, and we should kickstart our own discussions as a society on how we want to raise our children, national daycare programs, and calling the women's movement to task as well. The most basic and fundamental part of being a woman as a mother is our caregiving abilities. And one of the things that I have observed as a journalist is how the oppressed become oppressors. And I have noticed this phenomenon both as cultures and states and individuals. And our freedom as a society right now, I'm able to work. Some of you in this room are able to work. Our families are able to work on the backs of foreign women. And that's my reason for believing now that we should scrap the Live-In Caregiver Program, because I also believe that the Philippines is an agent of trafficking. And that we are catering to that by allowing the global migration of women and letting them come. Mm-hmm. Because there's going to be no protests in the Philippines. They have no one to protest. There's going to be no change there because there's no one to bring change. In the Philippines, I met a young woman named Kathy who looked 29, but she was my age, which is a little older. And she had 3 children, and she came from what used to be a middle-class family. She now lives not in the slums, but very close to it. She has an MBA, and she got married to her childhood sweetheart. She had a very good job in the Philippines working in a telecommunications company. Her husband, who worked in construction, and they had a very, very comfortable life for a tiny while. But when she turned 29, she dreamt of a family. She was also let go from her company. In the Philippines, as I said, everything is blatant. If you don't believe me, really, go there, believe me. It's right in the newspapers. The government and the foreign-owned businesses, the factories, they don't hire women past the age of 29, and they don't hire mothers. And if you have very Filipino features, you don't get priority. You have to look a little Western. And I'm not joking. So Kathy all of a sudden found herself pregnant, no job, and no future job. At the same time, some of the construction work began to move down. So they had to move from a smaller city to Manila so he could work. Now, because I'm a mom, there's one more page to this, but my children took all my paper. So I was going to run around and find paper, but I figured it was quite apropos for me to come with no paper. So Kathy's husband ended up moving to Saudi Arabia to work in construction. They had a choice. It was one of them had to go. And because he was in construction, they felt that he could earn the most money and she could be the caregiver. They've been separated now more or less for about 7, 8 years. Those children do not know him. He has taken on another family. She is a strong woman. She wants to start a company where she trains the other women that have been left behind to do maintenance around the house, kind of like Mag the tool girl, which I was really encouraging her to do. But she does get a little bit of money from him because she really coerced him to do that. And I asked her that question. I said, do you think the Philippine government is an agent of trafficking? And before I asked her that question, I told her, she looked at me really blankly, and I told her the definition of trafficking, and she said, well, maybe. And then I said to her, well, I'm going to tell you a story. While I was in the Philippines, I went up to the tourist area on the mainland. I think it's called Baguio. The president has a house there. And I stayed in a halfway house for women who had been returned from trafficking. Chatelaine is an anti-trafficking organization in the Philippines, and I stayed in their halfway house with some of the women. And 100 women from this tiny rural area are missing. They're gone. No one knows where they are. And when I'm staying in this home, I'm hearing that almost all of those 100 women were in the Middle East. And these women began to tell me their stories. And one of them was Walrus, who really touched me. She, same story, same background. I don't need to repeat those. Due to poverty, decided she was going to move abroad. Took out a very large loan to go to the government, took out a large loan from a government bank to do an employment agency, a government employment agency training course. She did that. She was told she was going to Romania. She doesn't know. No one knows, you know. No one knows. She was just hoping she was going to make enough money to support her family. She shows up at the airport and the employment agency shows up, and it's not Romania. She's going to Jordan. So in Jordan, she's picked up at the airport and she's immediately trafficked underground. She's raped. She lives in this home. She's repeatedly raped. This home has about 100, mostly Filipino, but some women from Sri Lanka. The employment agency men are raping her, and the others beating them. They're not allowed to speak. Then she's sold as a nanny. One of the employers ended up throwing, a female employer, threw scalding water in her face, and while she's in the hospital recovering from very serious burn marks, she decides to escape. She flags down half-naked a truck driver who says, well, I'll take you over to Lebanon and you can go to the embassy there. And so her only way, the employment agency has taken her passport. That's a very common thing in Canada, that the employers take passports. These women can't move. So she's smuggled in the cargo part of this guy's truck into Lebanon and somehow manages to get it to the Philippine embassy. The Philippines doesn't send her back. The embassy does not send her back. They put her into another room, this time with about 200 women with exactly similar stories. The Middle East, by far, The Arabic countries, by far, the stories of the women being trafficked there and the torture that they're enduring is nothing I have heard in my entire career as a journalist. So all of a sudden, Walrus is in the embassy with 200 women, all trafficked, and this is where the line becomes blurred. Looks legal, but it's really not legal. Kind of like when at the early 2000s, when women were using the foreign permits to come, the work permits to come and work in the strip clubs, and then the sex traffickers are trafficking them into prostitution there. The same thing is happening with the nanny trade. They're using that, and then they're trafficking them, either trafficking them as caregivers, trafficking them as drug mules, lots of different ways. At one point, the Philippine embassy invites the employment agency and the employer who had thrown the water on her to the embassy to come and get her. So Lourdes somehow managed to convince them to let her stay, and 7 to 8 months later, she ends up going home. And as I said in my speech, I gave a talk when I was in the Philippines to the Normal University. I said, first off, if I suddenly went missing because I'm talking about this, what do you think my consulate and embassy would do? They would be looking for me. There would be reports out, and it might actually end up meeting the press. Trust, someone would do something about it. You have thousands of Filipino women gone in the Philippines. Secondly, if I show up at my embassy, I am sure, and I hope so, and I said, you know, this happened to me, I have no passport, can I just go home? How long do you think it's going to take before I'm on a plane going home?
Well, under Stephen Harper.
Well,
As long as you takes for you to guarantee that you will pay them back for the plane.
anyways, this woman languished. All of them languished there, and some of them by the Philippines were given back. So I asked Kathy again after telling her this story and a few more. I said, you know, do you think the Philippine government is an agent of human trafficking? And she looked at me and she